Welcome to MrClaff.com's review of Reconstruction, brought to you by Noble Review, concise review books. Reconstruction was a time period after the Civil War where the South's infrastructure had to be rebuilt, Southern states had to be readmitted into the Union and agree to follow the Constitution, and African Americans needed to gain constitutional rights. You have to understand the difference between presidential and congressional Reconstruction. Before he was assassinated, Abraham Lincoln wanted to be lenient with Reconstruction. He wanted to heal the nation and make it as if the South had never even seceded. Presidential Reconstruction favored a 10% plan, which meant that if 10% of the Confederate States voters agreed to take a loyalty oath, that state could be readmitted. Congress favored 50% to take the oath, in what was called the Wade-Davis Bill. Abraham Lincoln never signed it. Andrew Johnson became president after Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Although he continued a lenient stance, he was a weaker politician. Not only did he veto much legislation, but he fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. This action violated the Tenure of Office Act. Johnson was impeached or brought up on charges by the House of Representatives, but he was never convicted or removed from office by the Senate. There are 3 Reconstruction Amendments you need to know. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment gave equality of citizenship. It also provided due process protections within the states. The 15th Amendment gave universal male suffrage. Many acts were passed in an attempt to give African Americans their rights. First, the Freedmen's Bureau looked to adjust newly freed blacks to Southern society. The organization aimed to help with housing, education, food, and jobs. President Johnson vetoed increased funding for the Bureau in 1866. The Civil Rights Act was passed over Johnson's veto. This act looked to make African Americans equal under the law. Many Southerners had a hard time coping with new freedoms for former slaves, and states passed black codes during the early years of Reconstruction. These laws denied basic constitutional rights to blacks, such as freedom of speech and the right to serve on juries. When word of these codes got back to Congress, a new form of Reconstruction began, known as Radical or Congressional Reconstruction. It was led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. The harshest laws on the South were the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. The acts divided the South into 5 districts occupied by Union troops. All former Confederate states were forced to ratify the 14th Amendment. Also, the former Confederate states had to create new state constitutions, which would ensure the voting rights of former slaves. The Southern states had to obey the Reconstruction Acts if they wanted to be readmitted to the Union. In response to these laws, outraged Southerners joined secret societies such as the Ku Klux Klan. They terrorized and targeted blacks through lynchings, which were murders often done through hangings. Although the organization disbanded after passage of the Enforcement Act and Ku Klux Act, it would rise again in the 20th century. Southern Reconstruction governments were mostly controlled by carpetbaggers, or Northerners who had gone to the South for political and economic gain, scalawags, who were the Southerners who turned loyal to the Republican Party, and free blacks. Slowly but surely, Reconstruction ended. The Amnesty Act of 1872 permitted former Confederate leaders and secessionists to hold office again. Reconstruction ultimately ended because of a disputed presidential election in 1876. Samuel J. Tilden, a Democrat, was leading Republican Rutherford B. Hayes in both the popular and electoral votes. But 20 electoral votes were disputed. By an 8-7 vote, the presidency was given to the Republican Hayes. However, as a concession to the Democrats, many of whom were Southerners, Reconstruction ended in the South in 1877. After Reconstruction, the South experienced a time known as Home Rule. Home Rule pleased Redeemers, or those who tried to eradicate Republican influence from the South during Reconstruction. For almost a century, every Southern state would vote Democratic in presidential elections. This was called the Solid South. But what about the rights of African Americans? Economically, most were impoverished because of sharecropping or the crop lien system. As sharecroppers, African Americans worked for a share of the crop, and much of their profit went to their landlord for rent. In a crop lien system, the landlord would provide supplies but would have a lien on the crops yet to be grown. This led to extreme debt peonage, or poverty. Though the South would attempt to industrialize in what would be called the New South, agriculture still dominated the region. Socially, Jim Crow laws were created and led to the notion of separate but equal, or segregation of blacks from whites in bathrooms, schools, and even drinking fountains. The 1896 Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson said that separate but equal was constitutional. Politically, African Americans were also denied Reconstruction rights. Because African Americans would often vote Republican, Southerners wanted to prevent them from going to the polls. To prevent blacks from voting, there was organized violence at polls such as the Mississippi Plan. In addition, there were poll taxes or taxes to vote and literacy tests which were quite difficult. If one's grandfather could vote in 1860, then the literacy test was not mandatory. This was called a grandfather clause and obviously favored whites whose grandfathers could vote. As one can see, despite Reconstruction's intentions, civil rights violations would continue into the 20th century. For more review, you can find free flashcards and review sheets at MrKlaff.com. We also invite you to check out Noble Review in both paperback and e-book formats. Best of luck on your tests.